Hi everyone, hope you're all well. I wanted to pop on today and have a chat about HMO valuations. I have written a blog about this previously and people are asking me a lot still, so I thought it would be a useful thing to have a chat about. So basically there are lots of different ways of valuing HMOs, and it is quite tricky to try and pin down how we want to work with the HMO that you've got. And if you're trying to appraise a deal, it can be quite tricky to work out how that's going to work. So I would say if you're unsure about anything, do give me a call and we can have a chat it through, because different types of valuations are going to work in different scenarios, different locations particularly. So let me break it down. So there are two types of HMOs where you can be quite certain in how those properties are going to be valued. The first is where you've got a property which is basically a house that's been used for an HMO. So the example I would give is sort of old school student accommodation, where I used to stay years ago, where you've got 3-bedroom semi or terrace, and then the lounge, the front living room, is being used as a bedroom. So you haven't really got any extra bathrooms. You might have one, but generally the property is a house. If it was to be resold, it would be more likely to be resold as a house than anything else. And they generally sort of in okay condition, but nothing brilliant. So that you're always going to be looking at bricks and mortar. In terms of comparables and how to work out what those comparables will be, look at the square footage of your property and then compare that to other similar properties in the area in the same sort of size. Now the other end of the spectrum is where you've got 7 bedrooms or more, where it's a sui generis planning property. In that instance, you will get what's called a commercial valuation on the property. Now what that means is that it will be given a valuation based on the yield. What it doesn't mean is that you can potentially value a property at something that is completely out of proportion to the properties that are in that area. So the valuer is always going to look at what is the sort of ceiling price for that type of property in that area, given the square footage and what have you. So when you're working out, when you're appraising that deal, do be careful. If you've got a property in, I don't know, Salford, for example, that's a terrace property in Salford, there's always going to be a ceiling price on that property, and they're never going to value it at, I don't know, 600,000-700,000 because of a yield. It's just not going to happen. You've got to think of it from a bank's point of view. If they come to repossess that property, how are they going to sell it? What sort of figure are they going to sell it for? And in what condition is that property going to be at the point that they are taking that on? Because that's another big consideration. It's not going to be beautiful like you have made it. This is, a couple of years down the line. So in that instance, things to consider. So what's your annual rental? Take off a percentage of that. Now when valuers value property, they could be looking at anywhere between 10% up to sort of 35% off that figure. So I would say be realistic with your rental figures. Look at market rent rather than the rent that you're going to attract. Take off, I don't know, maybe 20-25% of that figure, and then divide that figure by the yield that you would expect to get in that area. That's not necessarily for an HMO property, so it could be a single let. If you were an investor in that particular area, what is the yield that you would expect to get? And that's your commercial yield based valuation. So there you've got those two extremes, and then you've got this middle ground in the middle where you've got properties that are not necessarily houses, that wouldn't necessarily be sold on as houses, but haven't got a separate planning class to make them an HMO. So this is where we see properties that are kind of typically 5 or 6 bedroom properties, all en suites, or maybe all but one en suites and an off suite. Something like that, where you've got, especially where you have done the conversion yourself, so quite often there's been extensions, loft conversions, really heavy refurbishments where you're sometimes spending up to kind of 50% of the value of the property or more on the refurb. Now that is not going to be sold on as a house, and that's where we've got to find something that reflects the true value of that property. Now there are only a couple of lenders that will allow you to do this, but there are ways of having what's called a hybrid valuation. Now the lender will leave it up to the valuer as to decide whether it fits within that criteria, and the guidance that they give is around, has the internal layout, structure, fabric of the building been changed so that it's more likely to be sold on as an HMO rather than a house? And the other consideration is it in a renowned HMO area? So is there going to be a demand for both HMO room rentals and also investors that are looking to buy HMOs in that area. So they're the three things to consider. And normally what we see in terms of the figures on a hybrid valuation are the purchase price plus the refurb costs. So it does work better where you've got lower value properties, where you're not necessarily going to create an uplift naturally by doing works to a property. I was given a couple of examples recently. So we had a property in Dover. The client ran me through the figures, and actually a bricks and mortar valuation is fine. You're not going to get any more than that by looking at a purchase price plus the refurb costs. There was one that I was looking at earlier, which is in the north. It was in Derby, but again, because the refurb costs weren't huge, the property's in a decent condition as it is, then it still doesn't really work. You're not adding anything on top. Where I see it working is where you're buying rundown properties and you're spending sort of proportionally a high amount on that refurb in areas where you're not necessarily going to automatically get that extra value just by doing works to a property, if that makes sense. So you would normally look at, as I said, purchase price plus refurb costs. Where people do better than that is normally where they've got a really good buy on the purchase. So if the valuer agrees that the purchase price was under market value, they won't do on the purchase, but they might recognise that retrospectively on the refinance. That's how you're going to make a bit more. On the flip side, I've seen it where people have said, you know, you've overspent and you're not necessarily going to get that back on the value. What you will benefit from is tenants that want to stay in your property, so you'll typically get lower turnover of tenants and lower void periods. So in certain situations, it is worth spending that extra cash on things like, I don't know, worktops that you feel are going to last a bit longer, floor coverings that you feel are going to last longer, because it means that you're in the property less, it's less maintenance for you, and you're making the property look nicer, better quality for a longer period of time. So that's not necessarily going to add value to the property itself. So yeah, that's where that middle ground is, but you have got to be specific. There are only a few lenders that will do it, and you will pay a premium for that. What you've got to work out with our help is whether that's worth it. There are other lenders that say that they do. In reality, they don't. So if somebody tells you they can get an HMO mortgage for under 4% with a hybrid valuation, I would question that. They will say it's a hybrid valuation, but in reality, I know what valuer they will use. You may know what valuer they're going to use, and it won't be a hybrid valuation. They'll say that it is, but it won't be. But yeah, if you've got any properties that you want to run through with me, then give me a call. We can have a chat about specifics and see what works. But I hope that was useful. Let me know. I'll speak to you later. Bye.